Welcome to this video lecture on translation competence. Translation competence is one of the main bases or foundations for my model for the training of translators, and I think it's useful for students to remember this model throughout the course and throughout the translation major or the translation or any translation program for that matter, so that they can use this notion and as a frame of reference to evaluate their own progress towards mastery or proficiency of the translation or translation competence or the ability to translate. So the learning outcomes for this module, at the end of this module, hopefully students will be able to define the notion of translation competence, what it is. I explain also why it's useful. Why is it useful as a foundation for a translation training initiative or for translation learning? Students will also be able to list the main subcompetences or subcomponents or components of translation competence, in this case 5, as we will see later on in the module. And lastly, students will be able to use this model, this translation competence model, to evaluate from time to time their own progress as translator trainees. And I think it's an excellent framework for translators to continue learning and honing their skills throughout their careers. So the notion of translation competence. What's translation competence? Translation competence is, as we will see, is the set of abilities that enables a translator or a bilingual to actually engage in the translation process, to read a message written in language A, in this case English, and then being able to convey the meaning that is being obtained, gleaned from the source text into a new language or language 2 or the target language, as we call it, in this case Spanish. This competence in the past was linked to basically language proficiency. Translation can be done by people who know at least 2 languages, and that was the traditional view of translation competence. Anyone, any bilingual, can actually engage in translation and therefore possesses to a certain degree translation competence. So this was the traditional view, but there was no in this traditional view there was no differentiation between what professional translators do and what any bilingual individual can do when it comes to executing a translation process. So in that way it was inadequate. But in recent years we've seen that translation scholars have turned their attention to the performance and the skills that professional translators possess that would differentiate professional translators from amateurs, from bilinguals, when it comes to executing the translation process. There's also been a degree of debate amongst translation scholars in the past regarding the differentiation between what translation competence is, translation as an activity, and what translator competence is. That's the skills, the attitudes that an individual possesses so that he or she can act as a professional translator. And other scholars have tried to differentiate between what it takes to actually translate and what attributes make up the translator as a professional. So this has been an interesting difference made by some scholars. They want to separate what it means to translate and what skills are required to engage in the activity of translating, and on the other hand, what attributes make up a translator as such. So interestingly enough, there's no consensus, or at least there's very little consensus among translation scholars nowadays or presently as to what really is um, the best definition of translation competence, um, and what the components of this definition would be. Anthony Pym, renowned translation scholar in 2003, um, provided a summary, a useful summary of the different models of translation competence that have been proposed so far. He uh, distilled, he summarized the various proposals in four main trends or four main categories. The first one for Pym would be competence as the combination of linguistic competence. In this case, it would be clearly linguistic. On the one hand, we have source language competence that translators must have, and then we have the target language competence, which translators also must possess in order to translate. This is a more linguistic-based, more traditional view for Pym. The second would be competence as zero competence. Translation deals with languages, Pym reminds us in 2003, and he notes that this is really paradoxical when it comes to a Chomskyan point of view. Remember Chomsky, the eminent linguist from MIT, who is remembered especially for his theory of generative grammar. When it comes to describing competence, are we really talking about competence or skills? Or are we talking about performance, something that you do to a certain level of proficiency? So there's some confusion there that Pym points out in the second level, in the sense that there's some degree of confusion as to the use of proficiency, what strategy is, what expertise is. Obviously, on the one hand, we have skills, we have know-how, and on the other, when it comes to translation, we are able to perform a certain activity, in this case, execute the translation process. So that would be the second area that Pym identified in 2003. The third area, to continue with those four dimensions or categories, would be what he called competence as a multi-componential notion. In other words, that we have several skills or lists of skills that make up what translators do, or this translation competence label. For Pym, he notes that you can create lists and that this process is never ending. You can pile skill upon skill upon skill, and the process is never ending. So this third category would be translation competence viewed as a complex multi-level or multi-componential notion, which can be perhaps obviously from Pym's point of view not really user-friendly. And finally we have number 4, the idea of competence as what he terms super or super competence. In other words, something which defines translation and nothing but translation. So we have in this case what defines translation as such and makes it stand from other linguistic related activities. So Pym, again in 2003, he opts for what we can call a minimalist notion of competence, meaning, and these are his words, and I quote, the ability to generate a series of more than one viable target text, which could be ad infinitum, different types of target texts in language 2, or in Spanish in our case, for a pertinent source text. Thus, plus the ability to select only one viable target text from the series quickly and with justified confidence. So that would be for Anthony Pym, the more succinct or minimalist notion of competence. He takes the simplified approach, and there's a beauty in the simplicity of this definition. But I think it might be, even if it's more complicated, and we take things to a more complex or unwieldy level, I think there are um, other proposals which could be framed in number 3 probably, that would be more useful for us in a pedagogical or training environment, because they break down the different dimensions that translation trainees or translation learners need to monitor in order to work on the different areas of improvement in order to become proficient translators. And this is what we're going to be discussing in the next few slides, following Albert in 2017. You can check the references at the end of the slides. So some foundations for this model that I preview right now. It's a model created by a group of scholars and Spanish researchers called PACTE, P-A-C-T-E group. The PACTE group has been working on improving our understanding of translation competence from the early 2000s, and lately in 2017 they published in English compendium, a summary of decades of research, and I think their model will be really useful for us. So some of the foundations that Amparo Hurtado Albir, the director coordinator of this PACTE group, outlines in her prologue to a description of the model and the methodology followed by the PACTE group to investigate and describe the translation competence super complex or complex notion. Is first that translation is communication, is about texts, and is about cognition. So translation is a communicative activity. It is about communication. It is also about texts, which could be oral or written, and this obviously points towards parole or parole in French, or speech acts, or actos de habla in Español. Translators deal with texts, language in use, in context, not with language as an abstract or as a system. And then obviously translation implies or involves complex mental activities. Levels of equivalence. Notion of equivalence is key for translation, is a key notion, and they remind us, or Amparo Hurtado reminds us that when we talk about communication and we talk about texts, those are the main levels we are dealing with when we discuss translation. This implies a dynamic view of translation, not a static view of translation. We try to achieve different levels of equivalence, equal value between messages, between form, between intention from the author. We'll see that it is a dynamic, or we need to at least not lose sight of equivalence as a dynamic, more notion, more involved or directly related to levels of text, levels of communication, and levels of language. Translation must have a purpose. That's another foundation, important foundation, of point of departure for the model. Translation is an activity with an aim, and we aim as translators to meet someone's needs and specifications. Normally the specification will come from the client, and the needs will be those of the readers, the target readers of our translation. Translation is complex. It's a complex human activity. We are reminded, there's another one of the foundations for this model. It involves the identification of problems and decision-making process. What has been called, following the behaviorist psychologist, the black box, a complex process of tasks that's not directly we can really detect or observe directly, but it's happening beneath the surface, so to speak, when translators engage in translation. And obviously, in order to perform this complex human activity, the human agents involved in this activity must possess certain skills that will enable them to undertake transition tasks successfully, hopefully aligned with the expectations and needs of everyone involved, the reader, the initiator, or the customer, etc. So these are the foundations for the model. If we look at the notion, Orozco, who is Mariana Orozco, is one of them, has been one of the members of the PACTEC group for a while, has been really prolific in writing about transition competence. Many authors have been using this term, but no specific definitions have been provided. We already have here PIM's simplistic or not simplistic, minimalist definition, which I think is a useful element. All these authors that you can see there, according to Orozco, have used the term transition competence, but an explicit definition has not been forthcoming. On the other hand, other authors have not used the notion, but they have provided implicit definitions of the different skills required to navigate the transition process. Jean Delisle, for instance, a now retired transition historian and translator educator in the University of Ottawa in Canada, has done a lot of work involving or describing the different skills needed by translators without an actual